and on Descartes. So let me move on now to Descartes and talk about him, since that's what I'm supposed to be talking about. So how many folks have heard of the phrase, "I think, therefore I am"? 2, 3, 4. That's funny, because sometimes people haven't heard it, even in college. But of course, that's, I guess, one of the things that's especially attributed to him. And yet, if we go back to St. Augustine, reply to the skeptics. Let's see if I can actually get is this actually the text? All right. Okay, that's a writing about the text, so that's not. All right. Well, there's lots of people talking about it, but just basically, I'll point out that in his reply to the skeptics, and the skeptics at the time that Augustine was replying to were the ones who led the academy still in Athens. And they were skeptics at the time. And the skeptics said, "How do I know anything? How can I know that I know anything?" And Augustine replied in his reply to the skeptics saying, "I know that I exist, because otherwise, who's asking the question, if I exist or not? That's to be me, so I obviously exist. Plus, I know that I exist." So that's 2 things I know. And 3, I love knowing that I know that I exist. So for Augustine, in his reply, you've got these 3 things. And by the way, in that piece, he compares that to the Trinity. The Father, Son, Holy Ghost. I know that I exist. I know that I know, and I know, and I love knowing that, right? So that's the 3. He's not comparing it to the Trinity in any sense that we're kind of like the Trinity, but it's just that it's 3 things. But so clearly Descartes is familiar with Augustine. I mean, he grew up in a school, a Jesuit school, actually, but the Jesuits clearly are teaching Augustine. It's not a conflict at all. It's the basis, really, of the religion. And so he's familiar with Augustine's reply to the skeptics. So when he himself writes this in his discourse on the method, which is, I go to Descartes and all, okay. So there's René. There's actually lots of paintings of René Descartes. He had a fascinating life, even though it was quite short. He, in A.C. Grayling's book on Descartes, which I'll recommend if you're into reading books. So one of the interesting things that A.C. Grayling comes to conclude is that he was a spy for the Jesuits, for the King of France. That's kind of, so there's intrigue and everything. And that also explains why he traveled around Europe visiting even the enemy of France. And of course, why was he visiting the enemy of France? He was spying on them. And part of the problem was there's constant warfare between them. Part of it was between Christianity and Protestant. Protestant Germany Christian France. France ended up with some Protestants in France as well, the Huguenots, and so on. But Descartes is a Christian, Catholic by his childhood and everything. By the way, another interesting puzzle for me is Descartes literally means in French of the map. Of the map. And one of the reasons he's famous is because of the Cartesian grid coordinate system, which is the way we do our maps today, right? And who came up with that? Descartes came up with that. And how did he come up with it? It's kind of a famous story. He was lying in bed because he really hated getting up early, kind of sickly child sort of thing, which of course leads to the problem with Queen Christina getting him up at 5 in the morning, in a cold, dark Sweden, right? But he loves lying in bed late, and he's doing philosophy while he's lying there. And apparently at one time he was lying in bed and he looked up and he saw a fly on the ceiling, and the fly was walking around. And it occurred to him that if he had used a grid coordinate system to map the route of the fly, he would be able to basically record the way the fly was walking around on the ceiling. So he came up with this grid coordinate idea. But it just puzzles me, how is his name of the map? Carta, like the Magna Carta, the big paper, that is famous in England, because it was a big paper, right? Really big piece of paper. Which you could still go and visit and so on. Actually, there's multiple copies of it somehow. But in any case, Descartes means of the map. Rene is clearly a name. The town where he was born is Le Havre. Today it's been changed to Descartes. So if you think, well, he's from Descartes. Well, but Descartes came first. And the problem then, though, is his father's name was Descartes. So that just puzzles me. It's not really like his name was based on his activity or his invention, because his father was named Descartes. So he must have gotten the name Descartes because of his father. But yeah, this book argues that he was a spy. And by the way, the king died that he was loyal to, and the new king didn't like him. By the way, they also thought he was in a secret society, usually one of the societies that Dan Brown uses in his novels. And by the way, A.C. Grayling argues that he wasn't actually a member of the society. He was a spy trying to find out about the society. So he was like acting like he wanted to be a member, so he could find out more about it, but not actually a member of it. So that's kind of interesting. What's the name of that society? It's the one that has like the eye over the pyramid. Which one?
The Illuminati.
The Illuminati. Thank you. Yeah, which of course is on our dollar bill. Okay. So in any case, interesting book, interesting way of looking at Descartes. All kinds of interesting stories about him. Well, he was raised in an environment where you had some of the teachers like William of Ockham and thought everything had to exist only as objects and not as universals. And you also had followers of Duns Scotus who thought everything had to be universals. And so his teachers all argued with one another, and no one really knew for sure what was true. And in a particular party, a cardinal was talking with him, and he said, I could figure out, how to put all of knowledge on a firm basis. And the cardinal said, well, do it. And of course, that's inspired him to go off and write his work. However, he fled France. And part of it was because France no longer had a king of the same political mind as the one that he had served. So he had to flee that way, but also he fled to the Netherlands because a lot of his ideas were controversial. And one of the things that was still very prevalent was for people who had controversial ideas to be punished for having those kinds of ideas. You could be fired for saying something against the leadership. For example, can you imagine? Oh, wait, no, that happens today. Sorry. Too much relevance there. However, as you can imagine, things turned out to be safer in the Netherlands. You might think, why on earth were all these people going to the Netherlands? We'll see Spinoza's family, for example, later on has gone to the Netherlands. Why the Netherlands? Well, the Netherlands were in between France and Germany, and they had customers on both sides. So the Dutch basically were doing their best to be open-minded about religion. You could even be Jewish and live in the Netherlands without too much difficulty. Remember, this is also after the Jewish people in Spain had to flee because Spain became totally Christian once more, and they started to persecute anyone who was not completely Christian, including, of course, the Jewish people. So the Jewish families fled. Where's a good, safe place? Their network said, the Netherlands, come here, you'll be safe. So, of course, a lot of them went there. And so they didn't have as many rights as Christians of either the Catholic or Protestant sides, but nonetheless, it was a pretty safe place, even for Jews to go. And you could explore all kinds of things there, such as the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulip. This is kind of cool. You probably have seen this famous painting before. Yes? So this is the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulip. And Dr. Tulip is, yes, by the way, if you caught the name, even though it's Tulp, he's the one that started the Dutch interest in tulips. And they are named tulips, I guess, after him. But in any case, he was doing something that in many places was totally illegal, and that was dissecting a dead human being. So in this painting, that's the significance of this. He's literally taking a dead body and cutting it open and giving people an anatomy lesson. This is a machine. The body is like a machine. This is a totally different, instead of a body that's totally animated by your soul, now what we're looking at with individuals like Dr. Tulip or Tulp is the idea that it's a machine, and the parts all can be mechanically explained. And so he's basically showing, as he's dissected this arm. This is a Rembrandt, by the way. And we know that Rembrandt didn't actually paint all the people at once. He had them come individually to his painting place, his office or whatever. And he painted them individually and then put them in there, kind of like AI, today. And we even know who the dead body belonged to. It was a criminal that had been punished multiple times for stealing and so on. In fact, one of the things they know is that this arm here had actually been cut off because of a previous crime where they cut the arm off of the individual for stealing. So Rembrandt had to add the whole arm rather than leave it severed. And we know that Dr. Tulp paid the hangman for the body of the criminal who was hung that day, and as soon as the hangman took him down, put him in the wagon, and took him right over to Dr. Tulp's office. And the other fun thing is that this was a dinner and a show. So the people in the audience were actually eating food while watching this going on. And here's the real kicker, Descartes was in the audience at this event. So I just think that's really cool. And he himself is clearly dissecting things as well, because we end up with this wonderful image from Descartes. We don't even have to. So this image here on the left, I don't know if all of them are. But this picture was drawn by Descartes, and the main focus for him is pointing out that this particular part of the brain, which is there, and we call it the pineal gland, and it's the gland that sits on top of the spine. Anybody, any anatomy students, I imagine, might remember that. That it sits right there, and as a result, Descartes thought that that's where the soul interacts with the body. So you end up with Descartes coming to conclude that the body, which is a machine, interacts with our soul at the pineal gland. And you end up with an interesting dilemma, and that is the homunculus. Get some better. So the problem with so here's a picture of a person's head, and inside the head you have this person sitting there observing the screen, and he sees the egg. So he's the homunculus inside the head. So in a sense, Descartes' theory seems to imply that the soul sits inside the head and watches. Reminds you. Did you ever see the movie Ready Player One?
Oh yeah.
Where some of the individuals, are in like robots, and they're like the ones driving the robot. So in a sense, you get this feeling that Descartes thought the soul is kind of like driving, the body. Just like that. Of course, then people ask the question, well, how does the soul interact?
Does that look like a piece or an egg?
It is an egg.
Yes, that is an egg.
Okay. I'm like, that's not what the PMG looks like.
Frying an egg. I didn't.
I got
This is
you.
on the internet.
I just want to make sure it wasn't me.
It's been here for years, by the way. Thank goodness, because I keep using it class after class after class. But so anyway, here he is, and people wonder, well, how does he Because if you imagine a person, no offense, that's no arms or legs, trying to drive a stick shift car, how would that work, right? So if you have a soul that's completely non-physical, how does the soul interact, even if you give it a location in the pineal gland, how does it interact with a physical body, right? And so people hypothesize a homunculus in the homunculus, right? And of course that becomes an infinite regression, and it never really answers the problem. And as a result, you get the view that this is Descartes' error. Which is a book by Antonio Damasio. Descartes' Error. Antonio Damasio is a still alive contemporary who has written lots of books on the brain. In fact, he's like the, gosh, that looks like it's actually online, doesn't it? Wow, how about that? So, Descartes' Error is what he calls it. He's written other books, of course. My favorite by Antonio Damasio is The Feeling of What Happens. That was one of those books that really impressed me. feeling of what happens, where basically he taught me that every single event in the brain is biochemical. Now, that was a startling thing. You know, you think of yourself as kind of riding along and thinking in here, but what he points out, contemporary science shows that all those things that we think of as thinking and feeling and seeing and so on are biochemical events that are taking place in the brain. And by the way, the feeling of what happens, he also points out, you know, that's the emotional part of the brain, which is the, you know, if that part dies, you're dead, right? And you know, so basically every experience